Hi, Helen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
We can hear you too. Thanks.
Good.
Hello, hello. Uh, Hello, everyone. Good morning, and Bengalaba, and dear distinguished guests and friends. We also have online
Hi, Helen. Can you
participants
hear
from
me?
Myanmar, Haiti, Somali, and also from and we also have audience here in person. So welcome everyone today and welcome to our events, Fragile Futures, Finance, Climate and Conflict, and Supporting Resilience in Vulnerable Communities. So first of all, I would like to say is that we have for Myanmar online participants, we have Burmese translation. So, but please switch to Japanese for Myanmar's translation. We have some technical issues. And today, I would like to firstly go through that we have four speakers online, four speakers on this event, and two speakers online and two speakers in person. So firstly, I would like to invite over Ms. Maria Kurz, Program Coordinator for Latin America, Asia, Europe, and Climate Security Lead for United Nations. And second, I would like to invite Ms. Helene Maria Kite, Senior Researcher, Dennis Institute for International Studies. She will be joining online. And second, Mr. Harsin Yassin, he is Executive Director of Somali Greenpeace Association. And for in-person speakers, we are waiting Ms. Gadi Pierre, Director of Climate Change Department and Ministry of Environment in Haiti. So she's on the way to the States, but we will kickstart the sessions. So again, thank you for joining online and also in person. It's really good to have you and in this very first morning. And first, I would like to briefly go through about what is the events about and the events that we really want to focus on this climate financing for fragile and conflict states. And we have the objectives that we want to draw attention to the need for climate financings in fragile and conflict states. No need. Okay. And the second objectives, we want to raise fragile and conflict situations, communities affected by this amount of climate financing. And we have good speakers to discuss about how is the gap of climate financing for, especially for fragile and conflict states. They are the most vulnerable countries and communities. So moving forward, we would have online speakers, Ms. Helene. She will present about the climate financing gap for fragile and conflict state, and she will present about her research, the research from Dennis Institute of International Studies. And it's good to hear that what are the findings and what are the gaps of climate financing and what are the recommendations from the research. Then we move on to panel discussion. So let me invite Ms. Helene online to present about her research work. Yeah, over to you, Ms. Helene.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint presentation. If you can just give me a moment. Yes. Can everyone see? Is it clear? Yes?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Yeah,
Please go
thank
ahead.
you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to join this really, what I find a really, really important panel, bringing attention to climate change in conflict-affected and fragile contexts, something that I've been doing research on for the past 2-3 years, particularly focusing on Myanmar through a Myanmar project that I'm doing together with the colleagues from there and in the border region, and together with postdoc Justine Chambers, known as the My Climate Project. And part of this project is to exactly look at how are climate change and conflict dynamics interlinked in multiple ways. And in addition to that, we also did a specific study, which I'm going to be presenting today, on the gaps in financing of funding and international support to climate change issues in contexts affected by violent conflict and state fragility. And this particular study we've been doing as part of the UN Peace and Security Studies at the Danish Institute for International Studies, with funding from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have been, besides drawing on our own empirical research from Myanmar, we have been interviewing various researchers, analysts, policymakers, but also people working on the ground in conflict-affected areas, identifying the gaps in the ways that we can support climate change in those contexts and the dilemmas that are existing there. So let me change to the next slide. So just some general claims here. Areas of the world affected by violent conflict and fragility are among the most vulnerable to climate change, but receive an extremely low share of global finance, not only from the Global Climate Fund, but also from various bilateral and multilateral donors. So this link between violent conflict and climate change is, as I mentioned before, multiple. It's not unidirectional. There's been a lot of focus on how climate change can create conflict or tension, in particular over natural resources. But what our research is finding is also that when there is state fragility and ongoing violent conflict and tensions, we also see an extreme increase in people's vulnerabilities to climate change, which has both to do with the forms of fighting going on in conflict-affected states, but also because infrastructures, governance structures, and people's general socioeconomic situation is strongly affected by that, which makes it very, very hard for them to build up the kind of resilience and forms of adaptation that's required for living with different effects of climate change, which are particularly hitting vulnerable places of the world, not only because of the climatic conditions or the physical atmospheric conditions of those spaces, but also because they are already facing different forms of vulnerability. This is not something that I'm only saying. This is a fact or factors that are being presented by researchers and also increasingly by large UN organizations that are dealing with climate issues, that are dealing with security and peace issues, and by multiple international aid agencies and organizations working on climate change and fertility. But we are seeing a huge gap now between policy commitment, knowledge that there are these really, really deep interlinkages between climate change and conflict, and the actual ability to support and finance contexts facing violent conflict. So this is the gap that we have been looking at, in particularly in the policy brief that Justine Chambers and I have authored with funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. And in this policy brief, which you can also access online if you're interested in reading more details, we look particularly at Myanmar and Somalia as examples, but we also look more broadly across the board to identify what the reasons are for this extreme gap between climate vulnerability and the actual support and funding to contexts with violent conflict. And one of the gaps is that usually climate financing comes as very large-scale loans with very, very stringent requirements for applying for these kinds of funding. but also very stringent and very unflexible and difficult forms of reporting that both the states in conflict-affected contexts, but also the local organizations operating within them find it really, really difficult to meet. So these are kind of technical challenges. In addition to this, there's often an expectation that these loans also come with investment dividends, which are very difficult to envisage in countries affected by violent conflict. The second gap is that there is an extremely strong tendency among both the Global Climate Fund, but also from multilateral and bilateral agencies for climate change funding to be very state-centric, so that the funding pathways are through states or state ministries or state departments, or that they require some kind of letter of approval of a central state to be channeled out to different organizations working on climate change. And this often inhibits reaching vulnerable populations, especially because we know countries like Myanmar, Somalia, other countries, that a lot of territorial spaces and a lot of populations are not in fact controlled or governed by the central state, meaning that this kind of funding, even if it does reach states, seldom reaches the most vulnerable populations. The third gap that we identified is that climate financing and organizations implementing climate change projects are often very risk adverse. They are usually from within the development sector of aid and support, and they are not used to operating in conflict environments and are not so willing to take the kinds of risks that are required in order to work in such spaces. And that's also linked to the fourth gap that we identified, which is something that's also being worked on strongly at headquarter level in the UN and other spaces, and that is to actually try to bring together the different agencies working on peace and security, who are used to working in spaces with conflict, together with climate change organizations, which are used to working within the development space. But we also argue that there is a need to increasingly work together with the humanitarian sector on these kinds of support. So in our policy brief, and I have little time, so I'm not going to go into depth with our case studies, but we are briefly comparing Somalia and Myanmar in our policy brief, just to kind of flesh out what some of the dilemmas and paradoxes are in this gap of climate change funding to conflict-affected states. And as a point of comparison, we can say that Somalia and Myanmar share high vulnerability to climate change. There's a lot of extreme weather events in quite different ways, and that people's ability to cope with these are also affected by ongoing violent conflict in different ways. And also they share the fact that large areas of their territories are not controlled by a central state, but are controlled by actors who are operating outside and often in opposition to whichever power claims central state control. But we also find very, very big differences. And one of the big differences is that at the moment, Myanmar is hardly receiving any international funding for climate change at a very, very low scale, whereas Somalia is receiving and is just accessing also funding from the Green Climate Fund, $100 million that is going to be delivered to Somalia. So what's the difference here? A huge difference here is that Myanmar state is an illegitimate regime. It's a military dictatorship that is not internationally recognized, but that also means that the kind of climate change financing that I was speaking before is simply not reaching Myanmar because it's so used to being channeled through state institutions. On the other hand, in Myanmar, we have a very strong civil society. We have strong indigenous organizations, and we also have non-state armed groups that are actually working in the space of climate change. So there is potential to funding outside the state, but it's seldom happening at the moment because there is this legacy or this tendency to fund through states. In Somalia, we see the opposite scenario. The state is recognized internationally, funding is pouring into the central state, but it's still extremely difficult to get funding out to vulnerable populations because you don't work with non-state armed actors in those spaces, and B, you do not have as strong a civil society on the ground and in those spaces that are not controlled by the state as you do in Myanmar. So what these cases show, of course, is the differences in context, but also that there's no blueprint for how we might work with climate change in conflict affected areas. But we really need to take these contextual differences into account, and in particular take into account what kinds of non-state civil society indigenous actors are on the ground and who can we work with in channeling these kinds of funds and support that intersect climate change and conflict. So in our policy brief, we also have a number of recommendations, in particular 4 I'm going to highlight here before my time is up. And we do recommend that there is a need for a specific funding platform for conflict, violent conflict affected and fragile contexts, because the kinds of climate funding platforms there is now is really, really hard to assess for these kinds of contexts. They can sit within already existing climate funds like the Green Climate Fund, because we know how long it takes to build up new funds, just looking at the loss and damage fund, how long that took. But what's really, really important is that access to funding through this dedicated platform should come with much more flexibility and less requirement for reporting and acquiring these kinds of funds, so that it's actually possible for violent conflict affected contexts to get access to these kinds of funds. And it needs to be a global fund, we argue, but it has to obviously be anchored at country and regional level in order to actually have that kind of context specificity that we are arguing for in our policy brief. And we do also argue, and we realize this might be a bit controversial, but we do also argue that this dedicated funding platform should be able to assess without these kinds of approval letters or approval from central states, particularly in contexts like Myanmar, where we don't have a legitimate state through which international agencies and funds would be able to channel climate change financing. A second recommendation is, and I mentioned this before, this need for much deeper interagency collaboration. We are starting to see it in some contexts at headquarter levels. Somalia, there's good experience now with the conflict and environmental advisor that's operating there, that's really trying to integrate these different kinds of initiatives, particularly also thinking about how the mechanism that's embedded in the humanitarian sector may also be useful for working in spaces that are not controlled by the central state is very relevant to consider as well. Thirdly, we argue that as in other contexts, localization of climate change funding is particularly relevant in contexts with violent conflict and fragility, because it enables a much more direct support to civil society groups and indigenous networks, forms of institution building around both peace building and climate change support at the local level, which is particularly relevant because a lot of the spaces in fragile and conflict affected contexts are not controlled by the central state, as I mentioned before. But we also do argue that there should really be a momentum to also investigate ways that we could work together with non-state armed groups, ways that one could, through civil society organizations, also engage these groups. There is obviously a great variety amongst these groups. Some are not at all interested in environmental protection and climate change, but we have strong non-state armed groups in Myanmar, for instance, like the Korean National Union, that are working on climate change action plans, that are working in the space on environmental action. And in those kinds of situations, it's really important to tap into these already existing initiatives, collaborating through funding through civil society organizations that are supporting these kinds of initiatives. And finally, we are also arguing that there is a momentum to strengthen the international sort of lobbying and support for climate change financing in fragile states. And I think the panel that the WWF has organized today the declaration that was presented by 91 states last year at the COP28, really trying to push for increased financing to fragile and violent conflict affected states. It's really, really important. And we do also argue that there is a space also for the UN Security Council to push for this agenda, but also warning that, of course, we should not see a securitization of climate change support. It's still very much a developmental issue. It's also about peace building. We also, of course, should not climatize violent conflict and blaming all conflict on climate change, but looking at this in the ways that it is linked in multiple ways. And I will stop there because I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Helen. And it's really it's good to hear that you pointed out what are the current situations for climate financing in these fragile and conflict states, and the example of Myanmar and Somalia. And even if we look at Myanmar and Somalia case, it's a different case that the international recognitions and legitimacy. So I think today the session is very interesting because we are looking at the financing gap in Myanmar, the climate fragile and conflict state like Myanmar and Somalia. But we got to hear that what would be like beyond that if we access to climate financing actually. And the example will be hearing from Ms. Gertie. Ms. Gertie Pear is Director of Climate Change Department, Ministry of Environment, Haiti. Wait a moment. And she is also the focal point for UNFCCC. And one more interesting point about her is that she is also representative for Green Climate Fund, the Climate Fund. So Ms. Pierre, that unlike Myanmar or Somalia, and the climate financing does exist in Haiti. So it would good to hear from you what is the experience that you take initiations to get this to access to this climate financing, and what are the steps, and there might be a challenge as well, and how do you overcome accessing the climate financing for Haiti. So please share your experience and for other countries. Thank you.
I can speak in French or in English. English. So good morning, everyone. Then my name is Gertie Pierre, as you said. So I'm glad to be here and to share the experience that we face in Haiti on climate funding. So it's not different like Miss Miss the woman just said about Somali and Myanmar. It's the same thing. Haiti have a set of some climate funding for regional and adaptation and mitigation issues initiative in Haiti, but it's always through vertical funding. It's like we depend on the international funding, like Green Climate Fund, and then like a Jeff Fund, adaptation fund, etc. But we don't have a budget line, a national budget line, and then that we can know it's about climate change that we have to use for the country. So just funding that I just talk about is like opportunity that we have, the most opportunities that we have to simply the most we welcome in Haiti, and then but they have by no means sufficient to take the climate change in Haiti, several difficulties that we have. We already in humanitarian crisis right now. So we are facing a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenge on climate change financing in Haiti. So for decades, Haiti have facing climate-related impact, the contribution of the least of them. but which I can say that have that devastating repercussion on the country right now for the livelihood, food and water security and health, and also on the physical security. So, international ranking have unanimous. Haiti is among the most exposed of the climate impact, and then so we need to face some climate risk. So what we can do, it's like we are mobilizing for funding, make some activity and with a project that we think that can help us to fasten the climate issue. So what now we are on situation that we have the most of conflict in Haiti. You already know about the difficulty that we had facing in Haiti what now by the guns. So it was not easy making our work if we have a project that we want to go out and then to at the local level to make the to on the ground level to work, it's not easy. So you have to take uh um a flight to go no, on the most uh other region in Haiti. So it was never that easy to make some activity under the project that we are working on now. So the other thing that the people in Haiti have currently climate political and security crisis has become every of all humanitarian crises. Um, what now the number of the people facing acute hunger, it's more half of the country is I can say like 70% of the country have the hunger for fasting for food in Haiti. um Climate security right now is a very challenging in Haiti, and then there are request substantial investment in climate mitigation to prevent existing challenge from getting worse, as well measure to address the government challenge. And then we also fast in wake of social cohesion and human rights like violation that we have in Haiti right now. So those effort need what to happen together. What we need the fucking and thinking and doing more effort about that we are making. So in Haiti we take in account more on adaptation on climate change and mitigation because we are a seed country and also we are a healthy seed country. So adaptation is very important for us. And then it's like to say climate change adaptation cannot be achieved without addressing the drivers of conflict and instability. So we need a stability to make adaptation, and then thinking that we can have a country more resilient than any problem that we may face in at now. So that's our difficulty to have funding. We don't have a national budget, and then we need to go forward with international funding. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pierre, and it's really good to hear about how about the Haiti experience in operationalizations of this climate financing. And as we just learned from Haiti that there are also still challenges despite of having this climate finance, and there's a lot of issues such as this. The country need to focus more on adaptations efforts, and let me follow up, ask questions, Ms. Pierre, and about that. what would be the case for like other fragile states, then whether the steps, which steps are critical to get climate finance, and that to be in line with these climate finance mechanisms. So what would be like the first step that you would recommend for to advocate the climate financing institutions for the fragile state? So if you could provide like some recommendation, that would be really good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the first step that we need to make is making funding longer term funding. It's like strengthening climate resilience as a slow process that need multiple years commitment from donors. The second one that I pick is we need to make funding more flexible. So I think flexibility is the key word in a context of characterized by complex and multidimensional challenge like Haiti. Also, I think project need to have the flexibility to respond to deteriorating security condition and unforeseen climate events while preventing projects against. So another thing is a donor, any country, any developed country need to support the inclusion of contingency funds or similar type of mechanism in the budgets. Regarding injustice, any response to Haiti multiple crisis need to come from Haitian themselves, and then without missing local structures and responding to local needs, it is highly unlikely that any crisis will ever be resolved. So we need climate initiative to be aligned with the human rights standards and commitment by using human rights based approach, which mean I can say prioritize capacity building on the national and local level government in civil society, etc. Also, we need to ensure participant of communities and design and evacuation of the project. Practicing transparency by making information about initiative accessible no community and language. So it's also to at the end is accountability to large community and the government by providing monitoring evaluation and the community, including all of the people, women, young people, and then either elder people, and everything that we have to make on the country. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pierre. And I think it's really interesting that it's to link with the research paper, that the research paper says that these climate financing are more like bilateral loans, and it's a large scale, and it's hard for fragile and conflict states to access and also to manage it. And also, I think it's the one thing is that it's the flexibility of the climate financing. I think it's very important for the country, fragile states, that they need the capacity to manage, and depends on the country context, what are the needs for the local communities, that should be manageable by the local actors. And I think that's very important recommendations. And thank you very much for sharing. And now I would like to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Hassan Yassin. She is supposed to be here, but unfortunately, he has some flight issues, so he couldn't be here today. But it's a privilege to have him on stage. So Mr. Hassan Yassin is Executive Director of Somali Greenpeace Association, and he is a civil society, and he witnessed that there are a lot of climate issues in Somali, and he believed that he need to take actions, and he started a lot of climate efforts for Somali, And it's good to hear his experience and his view on the Somalia case in accessing the climate finance. As the research paper also stated that Somalia has this UN climate security advisor and also access to like 100 million USD green climate fund for in agricultural sector. And so, Mr. Hassan, it's good to hear that how is your views on this climate financing rolling out, and how is the operations, and what are the engagement with the Somali government and civil society like you? It's good to know the experience and the on-ground um, uh, results from Somali case. Yeah, Ms. Hassan, please, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I hope you can hear me clearly, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
And
Okay. Thank you.
begin with, or to clarify, the 100 million provided by GCF is supposed to enhance Somalia agriculture resilience. Again, it is very important to clarify that this fund will not directly received by the government of Somalia, but rather it will be received by one of the UN agencies, that is FAO. The usual thing which used to happen. That again brings us how local are facing so difficult in accessing the climate finance. Regarding the engagement of the civil society organizations, when the process started of the preparation of the proposals in submitting the GCF, we are glad to say that at least the civil society organizations have been invited or consulted in regards on what to submit and how to submit. I myself was one of the lucky people who participated in these consultations regarding to the GCF submission process done by FAO. This project in enhancing the agricultural resilience will be co-implemented with the Minister of Environment and Climate Change of Somalia, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigations. So despite of this engagement, there are key issues which has been lacking for this proposal, which initially we have also provided our input. The first thing that, and that's coming under how the CSOs will be engaged in terms of implementations, and how youth are engaged, and how it will enhance the locally led adaptations. So the first thing which we found is a key issues which is missing is the partnership with the civil society organizations and youth involvement. While CSOs have been consulted during the proposal stage, there is a lack of clear implementation framework on how the civil society organizations or locally led organizations will be adequately or incorporate this as active partners, as implementing partners, rather than just implementers. The other thing which was unfortunate, we could not see on this project is it currently lacks clear mechanisms for involving grassroots organizations who are mostly impacted by the climate change, whether it's drought, whether it's flood, and who are also the first responders to the communities. So there's a clear gap or clear lack of mechanism. How will they be part of the implementations? But it just keeps on saying they will be benefit as actual beneficiaries. So there's also a pressing need to establish more robust formalized partnership with these groups that are already working on the climate change issues in Somalia. The other thing which we have not seen in this proposal, which has been submitted, was the capacity building for accessing climate finance. For you to access climate finance, you need robust systems. And if our government is not directly accessing the climate finance, what about the civil society organizations? They will be more less to be engaged. So what do we need to be placed? A robust system. So we wanted to see how the GCF funding will at least enhance the capacity of civil society organizations to become more more able to access all the climate finance. Remember, despite of the project focusing on the enhancing the institutional capacity of the government of Somalia, then we need also to make sure that civil society organizations' capacities are enhanced in order to access the climate finance. For example, building institutional capacity among local entities, civil society organizations, grassroots level organizations, community-based organizations, in order to access this climate finance. So rather than even accessing the climate finance, these grassroots level organizations, even their voices are not being heard in platforms like in COPs where donors come, because they are not because they don't have the mechanism, they don't have the funding to travel all the way from Somalia to Azerbaijan, which costs a lot of money. And their resources have not also been provided. So that's one of the things that I would like to say. First was enhance the partnership with the civil society organizations, youth-led organizations, and grassroots organizations in terms of implementing this GCF project. The other thing is to enhance the capacity of civil society organizations in order to enable them to access the climate finance. Remember, the climate finance structure is very difficult the way it has been placed. Yeah, but we want the civil society to be prepared on how they can become more fully empowered to get this climate finance. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan. It's good, very good to hear about the Somali experience, that it's the climate financing is actually there, but as we heard that it's applied by the INGO and the CSO, the local communities are consulted, but it's questions of corporations for implementations. And it's one thing that Mr. Hassan highlighted very interesting is that the capacity development and institutional development for the local people to the local communities to access to climate financing. I think that would be also one key interesting. And I also check out that the climate finance GCF pavilion, and they also have a specific event focused on delivering climate finance for indigenous peoples and local communities. So I believe that it would be the where we could raise that what you mentioned about the access for indigenous people and local communities, the most vulnerable people, and what would be the way they can, what could be the channels that they can open for the local communities. So, Mr. Hassan, let me follow up with another questions that, so you mentioned a lot about the collaborations among NGOs, government, and CSO, civil society. And it's good to hear more about how about the reactions from other non-state actors in Somali, whether they realize or whether they focus on this climate resilience, whether they support the action towards addressing climate change in Somali. It's good to hear that what are the key stakeholders involved for you to, as a CSO, for you to engage in collaboratively work together to access climate finance in the future. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks. Remember again, climate financing in Somalia struggles to effectively reach non-stakeholders. And the reason why I say if the government is not able to access fully the climate finance, the non-state actors will be much lesser in accessing on these things. So the key issues which is missing firstly to highlight is that remember there is a limited direct access to donors and funding mechanisms. Non-state actors may not have direct connections with donors, multilateral agencies, and other key funders who who provide the climate fund. That's one of the things. For example, the structure which has been put in place, for example, the GCF structure, will not provide the accessibility. The other thing is always when it comes to the case study in Somalia, there's a perceived issues which is called lack of technical capacity. Most of donors or international NGOs get the excuse of saying that non-state actors, for example, civil society organizations, might not have the sufficient capacity to manage such climate finance. So that excuse already hinders you from accessing such platforms. So what we need to do is remove that mindset. If, for example, if as a CSOs, we do not have the capacity, then it will be your obligations. It will be one of the key things to put in to make sure that these CSOs get the necessary capacity so that they can access the finance that you are providing. But if we keeping on saying that local organizations don't have the capacity, whether it's, we hear this a lot of times, whether it's UN agencies, whether it's international organizations, whether it's government donors, this is something which comes to over time. So we need to remove this mindset so that we have a clear structure that let us build the capacity of these institutions, CSOs-led organizations, youth-led organizations, even try them to provide the small grants for them to take the climate action at their own community levels, rather than providing all the time excuses which might not relevant. The other thing is, it is again the complexity of finance structures which hinders. But in short, the civil society, non-states that are the ones who have initiated the climate actions in Somalia. Before 4 years ago, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change did not exist. It came from the advocacy from the non-state actors, from the civil society organizations who advocated the establishment of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. It is the non-active state actors who advocated for the policies to be implemented. For example, the National Adaptation Plan policies, whom we have advocated to make sure that it meets the requirement of the local community. The national determinant contributions, which we have contributed as a CSOs a lot to the on it is both its first stage and the second stage. So the CSOs are playing their role in terms of climate action in Somalia. It's now the ball. It is on the turn of the climate finance providers to assure that the CSOs got the right to access this climate finance. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan. And it's good, really good that you highlighted civil society's rules, and they are the one who raise about questions on these climate change issues and working on these specific issues, and also need to build up the capacity for more to access the climate financing in future. Thank you, Mr. Hassan. So now we have this country experience, and we heard a lot from Haiti and Somali, and it's good to look at from a different perspective, and it's good to hear Ms. Maria Kurz, and she is a program coordinator for Latin America, Asia, and Europe, and climate security lead for United Nations Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. So to look at Ms. Maria, to looking at one marginalized group, in particular women, how does the UN Women Peace and Humanitarian Fund support action as a grassroots level to respond to climate peace and security challenges? Yeah, it's good to hear from you.
Thank you, and very happy to be here and hear from these country examples as well. So the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund is a UN trust fund, and we are very much dedicated to advancing women's leadership on the front lines of peace, security, and humanitarian challenges. So what we do is we provide flexible funding, and we heard from other panelists the importance of providing institutional and programmatic funding directly to local organizations. So that's exactly what we are doing as a fund. We are providing flexible institutional funding and programmatic funding to local women's organizations on the front lines of peace, security, and humanitarian challenges, which includes, very importantly, women's leadership to prevent and respond to climate-related conflicts and injustice. So since our establishment in 2016, we have supported over 1,300 grassroots women's organizations in 45 countries with this flexible institutional funding and programmatic funding. And we've heard from the panelists here that there are several challenges. So Helen, you mentioned the challenge around stringent funding requirements and the challenge that the most vulnerable are not reached. So as a fund, we're really trying to make funding simpler, to reduce reporting requirements, and to take in feedback from civil society to make sure funding is actually fit for purpose to fund local organizations. We're also trying to reach the most vulnerable women and girls by making it an extra requirement in our evaluations to check whether projects are really targeting and reaching the women and girls that are most left behind. Gertie, you mentioned that it's very important for women and girls, but also marginalized communities to participate in funding, design, and to publish in local languages. So we've seen that many funds are only publishing in English or UN languages, so we really, as a fund, try to publish our call for proposals in local languages such as Dari and Pashto in Afghanistan. Beyond UN languages, so in Haiti, we have a call for proposal in French, of course. And to make sure that the civil society organizations that we support, our partners, are actually informing the very design of our funding windows. Hassan, you mentioned the importance of capacity building and institutional strengthening. So as a fund, we also have a capacity strengthening learning hub where we connect our civil society partners and make sure they can come together and exchange on best practices. And on institutional strengthening, we obviously have core funding, dedicated funding to support local civil society organizations so they can grow and don't just survive, but they actually are strengthened to grow as organizations. So this is how we are addressing some of the challenges that have been mentioned in the panel so far. But what I wanted to highlight here is that many times, particularly looking at women, women are seen as passive victims to the climate crisis and not necessarily as agents of change. But what we have seen through the support of these over 1,300 grassroots women's organizations is that women's leadership is very critical, and it's crucial to respond to the climate crisis, and that women indeed have innovative grassroots solutions. So just to give you a couple of examples, in Tonga, for instance, we financed women's networks to build disaster and climate resilience by building 400 home gardens with disaster resilient crops. And they introduced disaster risk committee meetings to coordinate and ensure adequate climate resilience and adaptation. And in Haiti, we are supporting also climate resilience projects with women's organizations that develop sustainable food value chains and develop agricultural products that are climate and also conflict sensitive. Now, it is surprising, and it has been mentioned in the panel before, that even though there's all this evidence how local actors, marginalized groups, and in our case, women, are very much at the forefront of the climate crisis, they are not necessarily getting the funding that they need in order to drive these initiatives. And despite being central, for instance, local women's organizations receive less than 1% of climate funding. And to bridge this gap, because you ask also about which action are we taking specifically as a fund now to bridge this gap, to bridge this funding gap and further promote women's climate leadership, we have made climate security a strategic priority for our fund. And we've also launched a funding initiative on women and climate security at COP last year, together with Germany and Slovenia in the German pavilion. And the initiative really promotes women's climate security leadership and their response to climate-related conflicts and injustice. Through what I said before, this programmatic funding, small grants up to $200,000 because we're conscious that small organizations can only absorb small amounts of funding. They can't apply for multi-million grants, and funding needs to be fit for purpose. So our grants start at $30,000 for programmatic funding and $2,500 for institutional funding. Organizations can apply via country-based time-bound calls. We had 2 calls of proposals already as part of this initiative this year, one in the Pacific region and one in Nigeria. We currently have an open call for proposal in Colombia. I'm just mentioning this here in case anybody here in the audience or online knows civil society organizations working on climate security issues in Colombia. This is currently open, and we're extending the initiative to additional countries later next year with additional investments. We also have a funding window for women human rights defenders where individual women can apply for support, including environmental activists. For instance, we are supporting a group of environmental activists here at COP. We supported a group of environmental activists last year. So this is a funding stream that is open on a rolling basis for anybody involved in climate advocacy or human rights promotion more generally. We also provide safety grants for these women human rights defenders because we understand that defenders themselves need to be defended, and sometimes they face threats when they return to their countries. And there are good examples in Myanmar and Haiti where women human rights defenders have access to this type of funding. So these are some of the ways how we support women's organizations and marginalized groups, but much more needs to be done. And we hope that this discussion is also part of a more general movement for localization.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I think it's very good perspective that it's good to hear that how we mentions about this, the challenges for operating this climate financing. It's always the last scale, and you mentioned that you do a flexibility of the fund and really focus on this, the more vulnerable marginalized group, and also build up on the capacity for the local communities in CSO. So I think that's very a good approach and also a good learning, and I believe that that would be more replicable or to do the same activities in like more fragile country states. And we are almost run out of time, so let me wrap up the today discussions. And I think it's very good to hear from the challenges and also hear that some of the experience from operating the climate financing. And in terms of challenge that we heard that all the climate financing are always a large scale loan, and it's hard for the fragile state to access, and also from the Haiti experience, it's also hard to manage it. And from the Somali experience, that even though there's a climate financing for the country, but it's not go through the government or the civil society. And for the country like Myanmar, I think we can learn from this experience, and we can advocate the climate actors, the funding institutions, that what would be the best way to unlock the climate financing for the fragile states in the future. And I think to close up the meeting, we also have some question online, but we are run out of time, and I apologize for that. And today event is that it's like a series second events of our climate focus events, that we have one initial events in June, like Myanmar Climate Action Week. And it's really good to have Ms. Gertie Pierre and Maria and Hassan and Helen to focus more on like what is the current challenges, and what is the existing challenges, and what will be the future. So I believe that this COP29 really focus on climate finance, and I think it would be the future for us, that how we will like the climate financing should be framed or should be designed to support more vulnerable communities, and especially for fragile and conflict states. So let me close the sessions here, and thank you very much our online participants, and especially to our in-person participants. And thank you very much for joining the today's session.
Thank you. Bye bye.